tournament gallery. If you've not met us before, I'm Keith, this is Mike. Our job is to try and bring people to life for you. So what we're going to do over the next few minutes is try and give you a genuine lesson, series of lessons in medieval swordsmanship. Because what we're doing is looking at the earliest remaining known Western European combat manual. It's colloquially known as 133, or the Valburgius manuscript. Mike's got a copy of a few of the pages here. It's a remarkable document, written and illustrated in the early 1300s, probably around about 1320. There's a complete series of exercises in it with illustrations and text, and it's also interesting in clearly being a manual that was designed to try and teach people the system that it represents. Now, it's a bit harder for us to understand it today, partly because over here we don't speak medieval German, and not many of us speak Latin either. And some of the terms that are used in it are really open question. So you talk to half a dozen different people, you'll get half a dozen different ideas about what's supposed to be going on. But perhaps one of the most unusual things about it is it was clearly written by, produced by clergy. A priest and his students. And that seems a bit odd to us today in the late 20th century because we don't really think of priests as being people who go around whacking people with swords. But we have to remember that in the Middle Ages there were two types of priests. There was the monk who was tucked away in his monastery and never went out. And there were the ordinary priests who often had to travel great distances. And there were the friars too, who were really the extreme versions of that. They spent their entire lives out on the road. And really, I suppose if you want to fight in the month, one of the best ideas to think about is Friar Tuck in the Robin Hood legends. A man who can use a quarterstaff, a man who can use a sword. We also have to remember that in the medieval period, not everybody who was a priest had been a priest since they were young. Quite often older men went into the priesthood, and particularly ex-soldiers, partly perhaps because they wanted to atone for all the killing they'd done, and partly because they wanted an easier life when they got older. And so it's perhaps not too much of a stretch to imagine a priest, like Mike, deciding to take on a series of students and teaching them some self-defense so they were a bit safer when they were on the roads. So enough of the background. What weapons are we using, Mike?
So the system we're using today is sword and buckler. Starting with the sword, it's a single-handed, broad-bladed weapon with two sharp cutting edges that take us to a fine point. So it's designed for slashing, cutting attacks, as well as designed for delivering thrusting attacks. You'll notice on ours, however, the point has been bent over. Ours is not sharp, and that's because in this situation, we don't really want to stab each other. We've been told by our managers that if we keep going through a stab and the rate we have been, we're going to be out of job soon. So we're trying to keep it as safe as we can. But in reality, of course, we're taking to a nice and fine point. Something to keep in mind is that weapons like this are not heavy, they're incredibly light enough to use with a fair amount of finesse. In the other hand, the buckler, a small, round metal shield. Now, often when you watch a film or something on telly, you'll see someone using the sword and shield separately. The sword to make attacks and the shield to make a separate defense. But in this particular system, the buckler almost always stays covering the sword arm and the sword hand. Very rarely do these two objects separate. There are occasions, of course, where they do, but not very often. So don't think of this as a shield that you hide underneath an arrow storm. Think of it instead as a shield you use in close quarters personal defense. The real question is, how do we use a system like this?
Alright, so we'll see sensible if too many of them fight with swords. They'll take some kind of guard position before beginning the fight. So Mike, you are the priest, you are technically in charge.
Yeah.
So what guard are you going to take?
So the guard I'm going to begin with is simply known as the first guard. So my sword's at my side, on my left-hand side, and the buckler is protecting the sword, arm and hand. Now we could suggest that this is called the first guard because this is the first position you find yourself in if your sword is still in the scabbard before you draw it.
Fine, okay, so as the student, I'm going to take a more common guard for the period, the half sword. So what I'm going to do is have the sword extended out in front of me, ready to thrust, defend, or, a little bit winding up, make a cut. So if I am from here in this situation, Mike obviously, if he wants to attack me, he's got to go around either side of my blade, which is fine. If I decide to make a thrust at him, where am I going to go, low or high? I mean, if I get him, obviously in the lower body area down there, that would be pretty nasty. But the problem is, if I go low, I expose my head, and it's going to be much worse for me getting hit on the head than it will be for him to get hit anywhere on the lower body. So it makes more sense for me to attack over the top. Now you survive. So what I'm going to do is make a thrust over the top of the shield. I'm going to try and stick him right in the eye. Thus. So if that would work, I'm in a lot of trouble. So the question is, Mike, you're not going to let it work, are you?
No. So the priest importantly tells you not to be the one to make the first attack. Because if you make your first attack, you leave yourself open to some form of counter. You leave yourself vulnerable to a response. So I know that the most likely target is going to be in the face, so I have something to do in response.
Very good. So I'm the one now that walks onto the sword.
Yes. So all I'm doing is I'm putting pressure on Keith's blade as he comes in, and like Keith says, he's walking on the M4.
Alright. So, beware, if you make the first attack, you try and thrust, you walk onto a thrust strike, you get hit. But you'd have to be pretty stupid as a fighter, even as a student, not to have a backup plan, not to have a second intention, just in case something like that happens. So what happens now is we perform the same action, but I have a reply to his thrust strike, which goes like this. So now, I force his blade out of the way, and if I extend it further, Mike will be the one who got hit. So I'm thrust striking instead of into his thrust strike.
Yeah. So during all of this, our blades maintain contact. So in theory, if I'm quick enough, my mind is working quick enough, I can feel what my opponent is trying to do. So if you attempt to counter my thrust strike, my opening move, I might be able to get out of it.
Right.
I use a shield strike. So to slow that down, what's happening is Keith is still going in for the thrust, I'm still putting pressure on the blade. Now as Keith applies pressure to my blade, I respond by pushing my buckler down into his, and then I can use the knuckle or the nodding cut to bring my blade up to the throat, and if I so wish, cut it. By doing so, my opponent will start to melt. Or not. There you go.
So this concept of pressure on the blade, binding, as it's going to be referred to in the translation from medieval fight manuals, now becomes the most important thing. It's all about trying to sense what your opponent's going to do by the pressure of their blade. But what happens now, interestingly, is all those ideas we just talked about are generally speaking accepted as basic stuff the student would know, even before he came to this manual. So the manual itself, although it refers to these techniques, then moves on to what is its own sort of signature plays. And to do that, you wind up breaking one of those important rules.
Yep. So earlier on I said, don't be the first one to take an attack because it leaves you vulnerable. So it only makes sense for the priest, the person who knows what he's doing, to make the first attack.
Alright.
However, we are going to start from those same positions. I'm going to remain in the first guard, my opponent's scholar is going to start in the half shield. Now, we already mentioned that to get past this defense, I have to go around the blade. If I just walk straight forward, I'm going to die. But instead of engaging the blade directly, or even instead of going towards the face, I'm going to try something quite literally underhand. I'm going to try and attempt to fall under the sword, which I think looks like this. So essentially, I am falling under the blade. I am bypassing the blade and attacking the hand and the fist directly. It's not going to be a killing blow, but without a hand, you can't like it with a fight.
Alright, so what's my reply to that? Well, goes something like this. So I use his falling attack there, his falling under the sword, to actually allow his blade to continue in that path. As he's doing that, I'm pressuring the blade and moving through to make my attack.
Yeah, very clever. Alright. Once again, the blade maintains contact. As he is displacing my blade and engaging in that thrust, there is a chance I've got a way out of it.
Right.
I say chance because it's quite difficult. I don't ever feel I've quite adapted it, so please don't hold your breath. No, I got out of that, even though you called my speech. There you go.
That was
Yeah. So if we slow that down, if I have it, that saves my life.
there you go. Get into that habit.
So I'm still falling under the sword.
I'm still taking the blade, then trying to pressure through.
I move out of the way, step backward. As I'm stepping backwards, I knock his sword down, and if I'm able to, snap the buckler and use that knuckle once more to finish the job. Or the sword earlier on, the sword didn't get caught in my habit, but I was still able to put the sword and complete the move.
Right. So that's called changing the sword. It's basically changing the sword from being over to under or under to over. But here's the thing, we are supposed to be holy men, and so far all we've talked about is sticking swords in people or cutting people with swords. I'm going to challenge you, Mike, now to come up and show the audience something where you don't actually have to slice me or stab me with the sword. What does that leave you with?
It's a Sunday, isn't it?
It's a Sunday.
Yeah, so you've got it there. Alright, well, if I'm not going to use the pointy end, instead I'm going to attempt to grapple. Alright, so we're going to try something a bit different. Generally speaking, safety is going to happen, so I'm going to try and fall over the sword. Let's see what happens. Alright, so as he engages in that thrust, I simply grab hold of his arm, in this case at the wrist, and from this position, we can go for a nice little walk. I can use something that's not in the manual, I can use the buckler and give a few slaps. I said I wouldn't kill you, because they would have knocked a few teeth down. Or my personal favourite, is makeup.
This is the Middle Ages. Right, so what happens then is that as the manual moves on, it does, in a sense, what any learning process does. It takes simple concepts, elaborates on them, and then actually goes back and says, now, let's use the simple stuff again, but in a different context. So, if we start, once again, with the same positions, I'm going to go and I'm going to use a simple technique that we've already looked at. I'm going to use it in a way that the priest doesn't expect. So there's an example of an offensive version of a shield strike. I move in before anything else happens, before any binding on the blade. I'm in, smacking him down and slicing him with the sword. And we can also use some more elaborate versions of grapples, because I'm in the wing. So there's a more complex grapple, which is more complex not because the actual move itself is complex, but because the timing, getting the timing right, is so important. So what happens with this one is, so I've got to make sure that I know that that space is open for me to
Use that with a grapple.
well, you try and get out of my grapple, I'm just going to meet you. Right. So, it's a brief introduction to 133. It's the oldest remaining fight manual that we know of in Europe. And as you can see, it lays out a very, very clear system. So what we do just to finish off is we'll run through all the techniques we've shown you, from top to bottom, with the running commentary as we go. So you can see how it's designed to build all these core principles in. So we start off with the least experienced swordsman making the most obvious attack, but winning, simply because maybe he's fast, and he gets that blow in. He can, he's good. But, as the priest says, if you're not careful, you're going to get hit by your opponent. In this case, with a thrust strike. Lovely. Then we say, okay, thrust strike into thrust strike. Sorry. There, so thrust strike into thrust strike. Good. Well, you should, yeah. Then we get thrust strike into thrust strike. Into shield strike. Then we start looking at priest attacking first, falls under the sword, slices the other. students in there with a line and a hit to the body.
Yeah, don't get stuck in my hand.
Oh, nice.
Oof.
Splendid. Then for a little bit of grappling. Got me. Boom. Then the student finally gets a chance to win by using a simple concept. So always going back to basics. And then finally the student's challenged by having more complex attacks and grapples where the time and distance is really, really important.
Get the makeup.
No, I still hate you. So there we go, brief introduction to 133. Myself and Mike will be around for the next few minutes. If you want to ask us any questions, take a closer look at some of the illustrations that we have put this interpretation together from, and have a closer look at the swords and the bucklers. We can't let you hold them, unfortunately, under the current circumstances, but we can give you a closer look at. Otherwise, hope you have a splendid day. Enjoy the remainder of it. From myself and Mike, thanks very much for stopping by.